Welcome to Catholic Speakers Online with John Roberto speaking on Envisioning the Future of Faith. We are delighted that John can be with us. As you know, so many of you are familiar with him. He's the president of Lifelong Faith Associates and the editor of the journal Lifelong Faith. He's also been the coordinator, or is the coordinator for Faith Formation, the 2020 initiative. And he's had numerous publications that have been of help to many of us in our ministry, especially with evangelization, designing the future of faith, the spirit and culture of youth ministry, living well, and so on. I think you're familiar with his work in a big way, and you'll see more about his work as he goes through the presentation. His email address is there, and he welcomes hearing from any of you if you wish to be in touch with him after the meeting is over. So at this point, I am happy to present John Roberto.
Thank you, Tony. Welcome, everybody, to the Future of Faith Formation. Let me give you a little background on what we're going to do, and then we're going to kind of launch right in. The four topics we're going to look at is really to kind of survey a project that I've been working on for the past 2 years. Just 2 years ago, I gathered a think tank of about 20 people to really look at the future of faith formation over this next decade. So today I'm going to survey the topics, the research that we did, and the practical strategies and directions. The four topics, we're going to look at some of the driving forces that affect faith formation and evangelization today. We're going to look at envisioning faith formation through a process that we developed called 4 scenarios for the future, and I'll talk more about that as we get into that. And then how do you apply the scenarios to faith formation in parish life? What are the practical applications of that? And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. And then I want to conclude by looking at the emerging role of what I'm calling the Faith Formation Curator. How do we access all the variety of resources available to us to address the diversity of the religious and spiritual needs of people today? The questions that have focused the Faith Formation 2020 initiative really can center around these two. How can we help churches provide vibrant faith formation that addresses the spiritual and religious needs of all ages and generations now and into the future? And those needs have become more diverse, as we'll see when we look at the driving forces and the 4 scenarios. And then how can parishes envision the future of faith formation and really be proactive in designing initiatives to address the challenges and to seize the opportunities, especially in this coming decade of the 21st century. So those are the questions that guided us in the 2020 project. I'm going to share with you kind of a direction and some suggestions as you can use this in your churches. A book resulted from this. That's kind of the look at the whole project and the research and practice. For lots of free resources, my website's lifelongfaith.com. And if you go to the Faith Formation 2020 website, you can download some handouts and materials, and in all the different sections, you'll get more background on the 2020 process. If you go to Presenting, the very last tab, you'll get PowerPoint as well and handouts from different presentations that I've done. So lots of free material to help out. The driving forces, at the think tank we did 2 years ago, we identified numerous driving forces, and my goal was to kind of take those and get them down to a working number. And we focused around 8 driving forces, and then over the last year I've added kind of a half driving force in a sense, the 9th, because of its importance, especially demographically. So I'm going to kind of do this, if you will, clockwise, and just highlight a few of these, and you could read more about these online at the 2020 website. Probably one of the most important forces affecting all of us in faith formation is the growing number of people in the United States with no religious affiliation. It's up to 15% of all Americans, so much so that the Pew Research Center will tell us that really the main competition for American Christianity is not among other churches. It's from people choosing not to affiliate with any religion whatsoever. Beneath that number of 15%, though, is a generational number. That number almost doubles when you're talking about people in their 20s and early 30s. So there's a generational effect here that the younger generations are not affiliating and, in fact, are disaffiliating oftentimes from the religion of their childhood. We were also facing a phenomena in faith formation in American Christianity that we have the second and sometimes third generation of children and teenagers who are being raised in homes which are not religious affiliated, so that they do not develop any of the religious tradition, heritage, stories that come with an upbringing in an explicitly religious home. The growth of non-religious affiliation, or what's called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, affects every single denomination in the United States, especially Catholicism, as we'll see in a minute. With that, the spiritual and not religious numbers have also grown. We used to talk about that as kind of a catchphrase, but actually we now have numbers to go with that. The spiritual not religious number can count 30+% in the 20s and 30s of people who stand at the edge.
This meeting is now being recorded.
Who stand at the edge of a religious tradition, but are not members of one, who are open to God in the spiritual life, but don't find a spiritual home in a congregation. And they are overwhelmingly under 40 years old. And in each of our congregations, each of our parishes and churches, we have a number of people, large number oftentimes, who stand at the edge of our tradition, open to God, spiritual leaning, but not necessarily engaged in any spiritual community. What we face, and probably as a classic example within the Catholic Church, but affects all Protestant denominations, mainline churches, even evangelical churches to some extent, the non-denominationals are probably the only exception, is declining church participation. The latest numbers for us in the Catholic world, only 22% of baptized Roman Catholics attend Mass weekly. And when you add the occasionals, you get to about 30% each week that you'll see at Mass. In some dioceses, the number is a lot lower. In one large archdiocese, they just reported the number at being 16 or 17%. So the declining church participation, not only at Mass, but it factors across all the sacraments. The decline in the number of people being married in the church has been a dramatic decline, the decline in baptism. So all those numbers tell us that when you take no religious affiliation and spiritual but not religious and declining participation, there's lots of churn, lots of things changing within American Christianity and especially Catholicism. The fourth driving trend we identified was increasing diversity and pluralism. The younger generations are growing up in an increasingly diverse world, and their degree of acceptance and tolerance and understanding of diversity and embracing of diversity sets them off generationally from older generations. And so one of the key factors that's influencing faith formation is that as diversity increases and pluralism increases, there's less that any one church, any one denomination can hold people's attention as the source for meaning and purpose in life. People, in fact, as Robert Lithnow says, the sociologist at Princeton, people are tinkering. They construct a life in this great diversity and that people are confronted with, and that diversity is at their computers. That diversity is in the media. They experience a wide diversity of religious traditions, ethnic traditions, diversity of and pluralism in values. So it makes it very hard to construct a Christian identity or a Catholic identity in that world when you have so much diversity. One of the big changes over the last 20 years, and you'll notice that all these trends are 2 or 3 decades in the making, so none of this is short. These are long-term trends that show, show increasing signs, in many cases, of increasing importance. Changing marriage and family life, very significant. As people get married older and have children older, Catholicism, which is built around a life cycle model of starting in marriage and moving to baptism and through the sacraments, as this natural way of inheriting religion, those changing patterns of marriage and family life are dramatically changing the way in which people join or stay connected to a religious tradition and an established church. For us, less people being married, less people being baptized present tremendous problems for the life cycle model of inherited religion. Robert Putnam and David Campbell, in their wonderful book American Grace, talk about we're moving as a society from an inherited model of religion to a chosen model of religion. And so therefore, as the gap between my family of origin and my new family grows, there's less chance that inherited religion will be the dominant model. So those changing patterns of marriage and family life, changing times of marriage, times of baptism, and increasing numbers present huge challenges for any church that's built around a life cycle model like the Catholic Church is. One of the trends that's not so much reported in the research, but it's certainly a dominant trend, is the decline in religious socialization at home. When you take all the other factors combined, you could easily see that the declining religious socialization at home, family practice, family traditions, biblical stories, praying, reading the Bible, those kinds of practices are in decline. Most churches, Protestant, mainline, and Roman Catholic, are built around a model that really, in faith formation, that really relies on the home. That families starting very young are developing faith practices, faith traditions, and the less that happens at home, the more churches try to compensate for that, but increasingly cannot. So almost every church is built on a model that religious socialization is happening at home, and their faith formation complements, extends, and deepens that. When you now have all these factors of no religious affiliation, the spiritual but not religious, declining church participation, it means that declining religious socialization becomes a huge problem and also an opportunity for churches. Most churches start faith formation much later in the process, at 5, 6, 7 years old. Those first 5 or 6 years of life become critical in terms of developing family traditions and family practices. So the decline of religious socialization is going to continue to have huge consequences for people in church and for faith formation. I added the retiring baby boomers. That was my 7.5. 70 million Americans will turn 65 and over in the next 15 to 17 years. And a lot of them are already active Catholic parishes. And the question is, what does faith formation with baby boomers look like? Because they're going to be reconfiguring life in the 60s and 70s, retiring a little, working a little, grandparenting a little, and volunteering a little. Very few churches I know are positioned to really do faith formation with the baby boomer generation, both to engage them in faith formation, but also to empower and equip them to share faith across the other generations. But there's going to be a huge opportunity as these numbers swell. And then lastly, the rise of digital media and the internet. No surprise there as we move into an era characterized by digital media, characterized by Web 2.0 technologies. Churches traditionally and historically have been slow adopters of new technologies, and this is where the younger generations are way ahead of the church in how to utilize that technology. How will we use web technology? How will we use digital technology to communicate faith, to connect people, to develop robust and vibrant parish websites, and using social media to really provide a variety of resources and activities for people both online as well as in person. So those are real quick kind of scan at some of the challenges, and beneath all of them are opportunities. When I talk about the no religious affiliation or the spiritual but not religious, we're not talking about people who are atheists. We're talking about people who stand at the edge of our religious traditions, not active and not members, but at least potentially open to our message and to engagement. How do we interpret their needs, and how do we reshape ourselves proactively and adaptively to address their needs? Let's take a look then at the 4 scenarios, because the 4 scenarios are an attempt to help parishes interpret the spiritual religious needs of their people. It's not a model of faith formation. It's a model for a way of interpreting the needs of our people and then acting adaptively through faith formation. Scenarios are built around critical uncertainties in the environment. That is, they're stories based on different outcomes, a few key uncertainties that are both important to the future of faith formation and most uncertain. And we spent a lot of time at the think tank 2 years ago working through what are the greatest uncertainties. Knowing that baby boomers are turning 65 and over is not an uncertainty. That's here. We can seize that opportunity. What are the things that we don't know that are going to have an impact on us over the next 10 plus years? And we identified 2. We asked, will trends in U.S. culture lead people to become more receptive to organized religion, and in particular Christianity, or the trends lead people to become more resistant? We felt that that question had a huge impact. The more receptive, the more opportunities that are presented. The more resistant, the more difficult faith formation would be, the more difficult it would be to really to reach out to people and to be creative and adaptive. Second part, will people's hunger for and openness to God and the spiritual life increase over the next decade, or will people's hunger for and openness decrease? We've seen in the last 20 years a huge increase in people's openness to God and the spiritual life, not expressed necessarily in membership in established churches. We've seen that decline. But openness to God and spirituality in this more global kind of sense. Will that continue to increase, Or will people be so busy about other aspects of their lives that God and the spiritual life will take a second place? Those two, when you put those two questions together, what you develop is a 2-by-2 matrix, and this is the scenario process. People can be receptive or resistant towards organized religion. Their hunger for God and the spiritual life can be low or high, and when you put those together, you get 4 stories, or what we call 4 scenarios. These will be familiar to us because we will find that we have members of our own family, people that we're close to, who really reflect and represent those 4 scenarios. Look at your congregation. Look at the teenagers in a confirmation program. Look at the people coming to have their children baptized, and you'll see these 4 scenarios in the lives of real people. Scenario 1 are familiar to us. They're people of vibrant faith and active engagement. They reflect all ages and generations and a whole variety of theological perspectives, especially in the Catholic Church. But they're engaged in the life of the Church. Their faith drives their life. Their relationship with God is central and important in their lives. In varied Catholic parishes, a variety of Catholic parishes, they may be 50 and over in some cases, but usually there's a mix across all the different generations. Scenario 4, to the left, shares with Scenario 1 an openness to established churches and becoming engaged. But their commitment, their spiritual commitment is variable. In fact, it's lower than people in Scenario 1 in that sense. In the Catholic world, we're very familiar with people who are uncommitted but participate. They participate occasionally, Christmas, Easter, Ash Wednesday, Palm Sunday. They're engaged in sacramental moments. They're engaged at events that a parish does, the church picnic, if the food's free. They'll bring their children to be baptized even if they are not very committed or very actively engaged. They will drop their children off for religious education even if they don't participate in Sunday Mass. We have 1 foot in and they have 1 foot out, and that's a large number in the Catholic world of people who are at least somewhat open to participation in church life. But on the other hand, their commitment to God is not driving their engagement. Scenarios 2 and 3 share, what they share in common is a resistance or a hesitancy about becoming a member of any established church. For Scenario 2, they may have been actively engaged while they were a child or teenager in sacramental programs and youth group and those kinds of things, but in their 20s and 30s moved away from established churches, but they're spiritually open. They may find that small communities of people, they may join a non-denominational church because of its worship or community life and its less establishment sense. But that's a growing segment of the American population in Scenario 2, and it is profoundly 40 and under. Lots of folks in the 20s and 30s find themselves in Scenario 2. They're open to God and the spiritual life, and that may be very important in their life, but they have not found a spiritual home within an established church. For Scenario 3, we call them the unaffiliated, uninterested, people who essentially have not found a spiritual home or have been a member of a church and just didn't feel that they belong for a whole variety of reasons. And they're not that interested in a relationship with God. Not that God's important or not important. Gallup says that 90+% of Americans believe in God, but that relationship with God doesn't drive their life, doesn't provide them meaning and purpose. Again, not atheists, but just not interested in religion as we would understand it, and not affiliated with any church. You'll notice in Scenario 2 and 3, thinking about Scenario 2, most non-denominational churches plant themselves in the world of Scenario 2 and organize their life and their ministry around those particular spiritual needs. In a 5-generational community, that is the typical Catholic parish, we have all 4 of these scenarios. In a confirmation program with teenagers, you may have all 4 scenarios present in the lives of the teenagers participating in that. So there's great diversity in the spiritual and religious needs of people in our communities. People participate for a while, and they may move into another spiritual need or profile in the 4 scenarios. So we can see lots of change and flux, lots of movement within this. If you take a snapshot at a typical Christian church, Catholic, Protestant, mainline church, most of our time and effort is spent in Scenario 1. That's where our energies, our time, our commitments are. Our programming is developed around those needs or to help people develop a vibrant faith and active engagement. Not so often and not typical would be the case in which a church plants itself in the world of scenario 4 or 2 or 3. What would it be like if you put yourself into the world of scenario 4 and you took people and their spiritual religious needs as a starting point for developing faith formation? So often scenario 4 folks are treated as if they were scenario 1, and they don't live up. They're defective scenario 1 people. And we need to imagine faith formation in a more expanded way that addresses the religious and spiritual needs unique to people in each of these 4 scenarios, and ask ourselves, how do we plant ourselves in the world of scenario 2 and scenario 3 and scenario 4 and fashion faith formation around the people and their needs? And if we did that and provided them pathways for continued growth, would we actually draw people towards deeper faith and more active engagement? So this is in one sense a map of possibilities and opportunities for a typical parish, but it's also a way to interpret the needs and the trends and the hungers of people in our community, or people who used to be involved in our community that we want to reach out to. So the kind of the goal of the 2020 initiative is really to think about how do we expand faith formation and fashion it around the spiritual and religious needs of people in our communities. We probably could have time for questions.
We sure can. Thank you very much, John. John is going to speak more about how we apply these scenarios, but if you have any questions about what he's presented up to this point about those scenarios, this would be a good time to ask them. As I mentioned, we will have time afterwards. We do have one question about the scenarios, and that's from Alexander Roblicki in Pittsburgh, who wants some clarification. Maybe you can say a little more about this, John.
Sure.
He was asking you is what you said that religious education occurs at 5 or 6, but socialization to religion needs to occur before that?
Yes, absolutely. Most churches, Catholic churches, Protestant churches, start formal, if you will, religious education, faith formation at 5 or 6 years old. And what we need to do is we need to start at birth. Faith formation religious socialization happens strongly in those first 5 or 6 years of life. That's where the foundation's built. That's where family faith practices are taught and modeled by parents. That's where praying begins. That's where Bible reading begins. All of those things happen, and they start right from baptism. And some would claim, well, start at marriage. That would be also true. So when you're talking about religious socialization with children, it has to start very early, which means we have to do a lot more with the whole family and in particular parents. Parent faith formation, and then what I'll call parent faith formation skills. How do you teach and live faith practices at home? How do you start reading the Bible? How do you start praying at home? How do you start a devotional life at home? Rituals and celebrations during the year. All of that starts very young. I'll often say at a workshop to people that if you're spending several sessions in your first Eucharist program teaching children basic Catholic prayers like the Our Father, excuse me, then you know that things aren't happening at home. Religious church going to Mass on Sunday. There are literally no church program factors in children's faith formation or adolescent and youth ministry faith formation that influence church going. Moms and dads influence church going. So we need to focus on that first decade of life, and in particular the first 5 or 6 years, which we don't focus on if we're going to really develop religious socialization upon which faith formation can build.
Thank you very much, John, for that. I hope that was helpful to Andrew. We have a question from Jack Buchner, who says when you ask people about their spiritual needs in order to meet them, he comments that most people don't know what they are. How do you help those kinds of people, or do you think that's the case, that most people don't know?
My experience is that they do know. And when I'm working with churches, I ask them to do focus groups to help people uncover what are some of their life tasks, what are some of the struggles that they're having. I mean, if you ask them what their spiritual needs are, no, you're going to interpret their spiritual religious needs. but in a focus group formatting, you'll find a set of those questions online at the Faith Formation 2020 site. You'll be able to discern their spiritual and religious needs by talking about their life situations, talking about the things that are important to them, talking about what's going on in their families or in their daily life, talking about things that they expect from a church. What are their expectations for a church? What are their hopes from a church? If they were to become a member of a church, what would they hope that church is doing with and for them? You can discern a lot of needs through kind of a focus group. You can discern a lot of needs by observing where people are and where they spend their time and their priorities. So when I'm doing this planning process with parishes, I often invite them to do focus groups by generation or by age, like 20s, 30s, 40s, teens, to develop some sense of who are people and what are their needs. And I think you can get them pretty quickly.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Here's a question from Alfred Turnipseed, who is asking about Scenario 2 Catholics and whether you know what percentage are flirting or affiliated with other faith traditions like Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., or modern things. Sure.
Not many, to be honest with you. In general, Catholics either stay within the broader Christian world, or they don't affiliate with any church at all. We know from the demographic information about 22 million Catholics have left the Catholic Church completely. And many have made their way to a Protestant denomination, and many have made their way to no church at all. So you basically have a lot of people in Scenario 2 and 3 who are baptized Roman Catholics. The people, you have another group, the Scenario 4, who participate occasionally in the Catholic world, and there we call them inactive Catholics, but it's probably better to call them occasional Catholics. So not many. Buddhism, while it's growing in the United States, reflects under 5% of the American population. And people from Catholicism to Islam or Hinduism is just a long way away. What's interesting is they'll make their way to other Christian churches, most likely a non-denominational church. Many are making their way to Episcopal churches or the new Anglican Church in America because of its ritual sacrament life. But not many Scenario 2 Catholics are looking at joining or becoming a member of an Eastern religion or Judaism. But just don't see any numbers on that. That could change, but at the moment, no.
Thank you very much, John. We have a few more questions, but I think we're going to move into the second part of John's presentation. One of the questions, and we'll raise it at the end, is about the relationship between evangelization and faith formation with these 4 scenarios. And then there's some other questions, but we'll come back to that, and we'll keep that in mind too as we go ahead. So, John, it's back to you.
Let me give you some ideas on how to apply these scenarios. I'm going to give you 2 basic approaches. And I think the first slide will be pretty clear in terms of what we need to do. Faith formation for the last century has essentially been a one-size-fits-all model of curriculum planning. And that one-size-fits-all has been a Scenario 1 model for those who are actively engaged or expected to be, and people of active faith, vibrant faith, or promoting that. And I think the shift of image and metaphor is going to move from the one-size-fits-all curriculum and programming model to more of a network of personalized and customized faith formation activities and resources. In a sense, in order to grow faith formation beyond Scenario 1 into the other 3 scenarios, we have to expand our repertoire and our ways of doing faith formation. So how can we focus on addressing people's spiritual and religious growth by offering a wide variety of religious content and experiences? Another way to image for this is differentiated faith formation. Not unlike what a great classroom teacher does in terms of differentiating instruction around the students' learning needs and abilities and where they are in their growth and development regarding any particular subject. We haven't taken that approach in faith formation, and I think we need to do that across this whole lifespan, from children all the way through to older adults. So the image I want to share with you is to think about this as a network in just the same way that the web is a network of hubs and nodes and branches offering diversity. We need to begin to think about how we provide a network. And what would have been impossible just 10 years ago to personalize and customize faith formation is now possible because of the new technologies. So I'll play that out and get a sense of that it's not just a technological answer, but it's a shift of images and metaphors from one-size-fits-all curriculum to a network of faith formation opportunities, is the best way to describe it, across the whole lifespan. The concept is address the diverse life tasks and situations by offering a variety of content programs and activities. Now, in the one-size-fits-all model, that somehow had to be done at the parish center. And what we want to do is we want to open up all the ways to think about faith formation in terms of a variety of faith formation concepts and models. So utilize a variety of faith formation models to address the diversity of life tasks to help people in terms of growing in faith on their own, at home, in small groups, in large groups, in the congregation, out in the community and world. So more available ways that we can do faith formation to expand beyond the on-campus scenario one model. And then secondly, to see this, that any spiritual or religious need, topic, or theme can be delivered, so to speak, can be programmed face-to-face in our interpersonal settings or in the virtual world. And so when we take the 6 models of faith formation, we can take any particular spiritual or religious need and offer people a variety of ways to learn and grow around that need, both in interpersonal face-to-face gathered settings as well as virtual settings. In addition, we need to think about how to use the web and digital technologies in concert with, it's not an either or, it's a both and, with physical settings. So the outer circle of the virtual settings, online communities, blogs, courses and webinars, small group studies, user-generated content, learning resources, audio, video, print, just accessing all of that, connecting people to all of that, helping people generate that content, and connect that to physical settings where there were interactive, transformative experiences. And so we need to broaden not only the spiritual religious needs that we're addressing in the 4 scenarios, but we need to broaden our repertoire of the ways we're going to reach people, because we can't reach a diversity of people in the one-size-fits-all model. So we're moving curriculum to network. We're able now to provide 24/7, 365 faith formation for all ages and generations, anytime, anywhere. We can deliver it to their iPhone, we could deliver it to their iPad, we could deliver it to their computer, we could provide it in print, we could provide it in DVDs. We have just an array of ways to reach people anytime, anywhere. And we want to integrate physical settings, church, home, community, with virtual online faith formation, websites, learning programs, resource centers, a whole array of possibilities. That'll allow us to reach the diversity. So here's a couple examples. And you can take this example and put any content in there. But if you start in the outer ring, just the different models of faith formation, on your own, small group, family at home, the traditional 4-week lecture series. So we're preparing for the next lectionary cycle, the Gospel of Mark. And we want to give people a variety of ways to prepare that doesn't rely on the one-size-fits-all model. So we provide online resources for people to learn on their own. And we connect them to great content that's available online through existing websites, through our parish resource center online. Small group course can be online or physical. The family at home, delivering materials and activities to them in a variety of different formats. Videotaping the lecture series, so it's available the next morning online for those who didn't make the series and reach a wider audience. Using our family program, our intergenerational program to prepare people for the new lectionary, using our youth program, et cetera, et cetera. All of that can then feed into a face-to-face program we create, where everybody comes together in a whole church gathering to share what they learned, how they learned, and to celebrate that learning. So it's not either or. It's not diversity or community. It's both and. And you can reverse that model. You could put anything in the Sunday worship box. Any gathered program, any church-wide event could be in where Sunday worship is. But the key is, how do you extend Sunday worship into everyday life? Well, how do you extend our youth ministry? How do you extend our confirmation? How do you extend marriage prep? Or marriage celebration? How do you extend baptism into the life, into the world? And again, you're differentiating faith formation by offering just a variety of ways for people to extend Sunday worship, their participation there, into the virtual world, into the one-on-one world, into the on-your-own world, into the small group world. And so just a whole variety of things I'd make available to people, most of which are already created for us. We don't even have to create these things. We have to access those and make them available, and then provide ways for people to share it in person, a blog or a forum. It's another way to take a gathered experience and differentiate the continued education, learning, and faith formation. It's also a way for people who are leaning in scenario 2 or scenario 4 to come in contact with us and perhaps draw them into Sunday worship. So in both examples, differentiated, moving to a whole group, we're going to reach a lot of people who may or may not come to the whole church gathering, but we're providing a lot of opportunities for them to learn whatever the content is. In this case, it was the Gospel of Mark. But you could substitute any content, and the template works. And then vice versa. We're starting with a gathered experience, and we're differentiating the faith formation, reaching a diversity, and you could target people's spiritual religious needs in the diversity that you offer. But it centers here in whatever the gathered experience is. For people who didn't get to the gathered experience, this is a taste of what we experienced together and invites them to participate with us. So you get that both and, moving from the center out or from outside in. So those are examples of kind of looking at whole church kinds of examples. But you could also do targeted faith formation. You could take a particular scenario and the needs of people in that scenario and target people who are unserved or underserved. For example, in scenario 1, I said it before, very few churches are ready for baby boomers, and in many cases, baby boomers are low-hanging fruit. You can contact them, you can find them, they're at Sunday Mass, they're involved, they're engaged, they're in the community, they still haven't moved. So the opportunities for faith formation with a group that traditionally we haven't done faith formation with, people in the mid-50s to early 70s, the boomer generation moving through is a wonderful opportunity for churches to seize that. And of course, if you get the boomers, the grandparent generation, you open the doors to getting the parent and the grandchildren generation as well. You can target scenario 2, 20 to 30-year-olds. You can move faith formation out to third place settings in the community, where you're doing faith formation in the cafe setting, you're doing it in the gym, you're doing it off the campus, where people may be hesitant about coming to the church for something. They may be very open to having a spiritual conversation with people. Group Publishing has done a wonderful resource called Life Tree Cafe, which is basically a cafe in the community in which you host a spiritual conversation with people, explore the meaning and purpose of life. There's all kinds of wonderful models and examples of that. Even in scenario 3, I'll pick an example here, the events concert example. I've worked with a couple of churches that have done community-wide arts and music festivals in the church, drawing the whole community together, and in that setting providing a home for artists and musicians and the whole community as a way to reach out and begin to engage people and contact them. One of the best examples of Scenario 3 ministry is what happens on a Habitat for Humanity Build a House Week, where the church group that always is involved every year in building a house rubs shoulders with people who are uninterested and unaffiliated with organized religion. But in these real-life people, organized religion has a face, it has a passion, they see the faith, they hear the stories, they can be drawn into at least conversation around how their faith drives them to serve the poor. And so we have lots of those kind of opportunities just sitting there if we interpret the needs of people and respond. And in scenario 4, picking up people at baptism. They bring their children to be baptized and developing faith formation with young families, or developing pathways for them to grow more deeply into their faith. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. We have the RCIA process for those who want to come from the outside into our community, but we don't have many good pathways for within these scenarios to grow, helping people grow towards active engagement and a deeper faith. So that's what I mean by pathways. Let's give an example. Here's an example of focusing on young families. And not that anybody would do all of this, but it gives you an example of what would happen if you wrap faith formation around the needs of young families. In really all the scenarios, but especially scenario 1 and 4, and especially 4, where you're trying to help them develop at-home family faith practices, and starting early in the religious socialization. So things like mentors, maybe from the baby boomer generation, who are going to mentor them not just for a couple of weeks during a program for baptism, but actually mentor them for 5 or 6 years. Helping them develop what we call 4 keys activities: prayer, rituals, Bible, family conversations, service. Developing parent faith formation. I've often thought that around baptism we need to do kind of, in quotes, an RCIA for parents who are having their children baptized. Parenting skills. We can deliver that through social media, workshops, online resources. Working with milestones and enhancing faith formation around milestones like first baptism anniversary, first prayer, start of school, those kinds of things. Support groups, an early childhood program for the children themselves, could be in connection with Sunday Mass. Family gatherings, maybe quarterly gather young families. Quarterly gather them in family small group clusters, depending on our congregation. But the image of wrapping faith formation around them in a diverse way to address their needs. So the nice thing about a Catholic parish is these opportunities appear all the time. It's a moment of seizing those opportunities because we have a sacramental system that provides us opportunities to fashion faith formation around people's needs. Alpha USA is a wonderful example of, and this is an international program, of addressing spiritual seekers. It's called the Meaning and Purpose in Life course. And what they do, I think we'll take a look at. What they do is what I'll kind of a basic 10-session in a variety of locations, often not at church, but looking at what does life mean? What is the meaning, purpose of life? And if you're thinking about 20 and 30-somethings, of kind of reintroducing them to Jesus and the gospel. This is kind of just basic questions that they would be asking. Tens of thousands of people have gone through the Alpha course as a kind of reintroduction to the Christian life. Our Lady of Soledad did a Pathways program for people. This is Our Lady of Soledad in California. And they went to Saddleback Church, and they spent time studying how Saddleback helped people who were kind of watching, coming to worship, maybe occasionally participating, become more actively engaged members of Saddleback Church, where Rick Warren is. And they took the class process, which was 5 elements from Saddleback, and they turned them into 5 mini retreats, and they made it Catholic. And that's what you see here in this example. They help people move through a process to make them help them become more actively engaged in Our Lady of Soledad and deeper in their faith as Catholics. These opportunities appear to us, I think, all the time. Another example is right from the Paulist Catholic Evangelization Center. This is a reconnecting with Catholic faith. Again, the same kinds of how do we help people provide a pathway who want to become more actively engaged and deepen their faith. All of these settings allow us to do the same thing that we talked about in the earlier examples. Take our gathered program, whether it's Alpha, whether it's the mini retreats, whether it's the Awakening Faith, and build around that variety of ways to support and differentiate the learning and faith growth. Mentors, blogs, social media, online prayer partners, 4 keys activities from the home, online resources correlated to whatever the topics that we're exploring in the gathered session, so that every gathered program can be extended into everyday life. We have the opportunity right now to make that happen. We have the opportunity to use all this wonderful technology for our purposes. It's literally going to be a revolution in the way we think about faith formation, in thinking about us both in gathered, family, home, community, church settings, and in virtual settings that just take us and just broaden all our possibilities out. But what will this mean? For us in leadership roles, it means we'll have to begin to think about our role differently. And I'm naming it as a faith formation curator. We're all familiar with museum curators and the wonderful things that they do as they aggregate artwork and they evaluate it and then they assemble and organize it in a way that's intelligible for us who are not artists and are not museum curators. What if you took that same role and applied it to faith formation? The shift you'd have is this. We shift from providing religious content and at worst managing programs to curating religious content and experiences for all ages. And that curating can be both in-person programming, online, print, media. A content curator, which is what, in fact, all of us do to some extent, This is just taking it and making it front and center. A content curator is someone who continually finds, groups, organizes, and shares the best and most relevant content on a specific subject to match the needs of a specific audience. Well, it's a perfect definition of differentiating. How do you address the four scenarios and the diversity of spiritual needs, ages, and generations? How do you provide a diversity of religious content and experiences? Curators are able to do that, and now we have ways to access tremendous amounts of content and experiences not available to us just 5 or 10 years ago. So what would you curate? Programs and activities, community programs and activities, people resources in our own community, print resources, audio, video, art, drama, music, online content like websites, courses, and blogs, apps. The number of Bible apps alone is in the 40s and 50s, and digital resources, which just continues to grow. So the opportunities and resources available to us just continue to grow and multiply. The process of curation and the redefinition of that is we spend a lot of time contacting, working, researching, finding the best things for a particular age group, topic, need, or scenario. Aggregating that content, evaluating it, delivering it, communicating, and connecting people to it. Most folks already do this. If you take, for example, an example of you're adopting a vacation Bible school program for next summer. You probably buy 5 or 6 starter kits to evaluate and look at them all, the content, the pictures, the activities, appropriate theology, use of scripture, etc. So people do curation all the time. This is just taking it and making it a broader concept for all that we do to address a much wider range of people's needs and concerns and interests. And it's a way to provide programming for all the 4 scenarios, online and face-to-face. For examples of this, check out NPR Music. This is a perfect curation site. They don't produce music, they make it accessible to people, and they evaluate it, aggregate it, recommend it. Another wonderful site is New York Times does this every day. In the Times topics, it takes all the content they've been developing at the Times, and they aggregate it, and they put, see on the left side there, most popular topics. So they save you all the work of trying to find that content. That's what we need to do for the people in our parishes. Faith and Leadership is from Duke Divinity. They're a curator. They look at all kinds of content and make available the best on the topics of faith and leadership in church settings. And by the way, all of these are free. Ministry Matters, the United Methodist Church is providing this. And the kinds of things you find online, articles and videos and blogs and audio and music discussions, just think of that as almost like a template for what we can be doing to meet the diversity of religious and spiritual needs that people have. And one of my favorite sites is My Jewish Learning. I wish we had My Catholic Learning. But look at, in one site, Holidays, Life, Culture, Beliefs, Practices, History, Text, and Israel. You have one site that could be a model for what a parish faith formation resource center for all ages and generations around the 4 scenarios could look like, with great content, all accessible and all free, but targeted around the different needs that people have. Busted Halo is another example of a wonderful curated site for people in their 20s and 30s, with lots of content, lots of variety, again, for young adults across a whole spectrum of spiritual and religious needs. That gives you kind of a survey, and we could go, obviously, for another day or two just talking about how to apply it. But that's the fundamental insight. The 4 scenarios, looking at them in terms of personalizing and customizing faith formation around our people. Secondly, being able to then to use that as a model for different approaches and strategies in faith formation that are both virtual and face-to-face, and then reimagining our role as curating religious content and experiences in a whole variety of different ways to address people's needs, religious and spiritual needs, and to draw them deeper into relationship with God and commitment to God and the Christian life, into active engagement in our communities.
Well, thank you very much, John, for a very comprehensive overview of some of the ways that we can reach out to the people in the various scenarios that you described. I think you said a lot of things that are really helpful and on target. We do have some questions, a number of questions, so you might want to take a minute with each. Some of them you may have partially answered, but I don't want to shortchange what people are asking, so I'll just show them and you can deal with that. Daniel Hardister wants to know about the interplay of evangelization and faith formation with these four scenarios.
My short answer is don't make distinctions. It's all about, and both evangelization and faith formation are just interconnected and intertwined. Their goals are to awaken people's faith, deepen their faith, draw them into active engagement in our community. So I've been counseling people, don't worry about what you name this as much as doing it. Because I think a lot of times you get hung up on defining evangelization and faith formation, and then it stops there. I think all faith formation is evangelizing. If it's not good faith formation. And I think because we see the needs in scenario 2, 3, and 4, I talk about how faith formation needs to have an outreach dimension. If that's what you mean by evangelization, that works. But everything we do in faith formation has to be evangelizing. Has to draw people into relationship with Christ, into deeper faith, into active discipleship, and into belonging in our communities. So it all connects, in my mind. So I've been moving away from trying to get people to talk about defining it. Just do faith formation with an evangelizing focus and watch what happens.
Thank you very much, John. From Susan Barillo, we have this question. She's asking about how we go out into the marketplace. And again, I think you've given us some suggestions, but you might want to comment on that, how we can go out and teach instead of saying to people, come here and learn.
A couple of thoughts. Number one, when you have a strategy, we have a virtual strategy, with an online strategy, great parish website with great resources. You're using social media. You're out in the marketplace. That's where people are gathering online. Physically, that example, for example, of the Third Place Cafe is being out in the world, meeting people there. Things like Habitat, the arts and drama examples are things that are being done out in the world. And most importantly, taking people in scenario 1 and empowering them with the confidence and the faith-sharing skills to be able to express their faith in daily life. There's a whole project going on among mainline Protestant churches called Unbinding the Gospel. Martha Grace Reese, her website is ReeseNet, or GraceNet. But she's done a series of research. She's working with 10,000 Protestant churches to empower people in scenario 1 to go out in the world and be able to share their faith comfortably in everyday life, and also invite people into a process in their church just to try out membership in their church. It's a wonderful process of taking people in scenario 1 and giving them the skills and confidence to go out in the world and say, live your faith out there. We're going to resource you and support you.
Thank you very much, John. I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to choose this one from Mary Wyatt, who asks, what would be a first step for implementing this vision?
Well, the first step I would do is just go online and download the planning process and the handout. It's there. It's free. Just go to faithformation2020.net and get that, and it'll give you some of the steps. But the two first steps I would make is this. Number one, interpret what you're doing in your church right now through the lens of the 4 scenarios. Who you're serving, who aren't you serving? What ages and generations are you serving or not serving? So use the 4 scenarios as an interpretive tool. Then secondly, start making contact with people, and I have a little process in there for focus groups or observation, and start interpreting people's needs in the 4 scenarios. And then the third thing I would do is target one group in one of the scenarios that you want to go for. You want to develop a new initiative to reach people's needs that are not being met at all. And it can be in any one of the 4 scenarios. Don't try to tackle dozens of initiatives. Tackle one initiative to begin with. So go for baby boomers because you can reach them. Or go for baptism prep or first Eucharist prep because you want to address the whole family and parents. So I would start with things that you have that need to be expanded, deepened, enriched with this perspective, and build from those. Don't do things that are competing with other people. Do things that aren't being done right now that would really make an impact. And if you want to make a real impact on a parish, go pick on the young families from baptism to first Eucharist. Focus on them. My hunch is nobody's working with them right now, and you'll get a lot of support, and you can bring the grandparent generation, those baby boomers, in to help you with that. Those would be a couple of things I'd offer right at that. But you don't have to tackle the whole parish community. You can take a very targeted approach and find something that you've got some energy and passion for. There's plenty to do.
Well, thank you again very much, John. Since we're nearing 4 o'clock, I'm going to move us towards our close and announcements. And the first, of course, is to thank you, John, for a very fine presentation. You engaged us on a variety of levels, and the number of questions that are remaining shows that people are still thinking about some of the things that you have said. And I do want to thank all of you who are participating for your attendance and your commitment to learn new strategies for reaching out to others in faith, for bringing this good news to people in all different kinds of scenarios. We appreciate your presence with us and your collaboration with us too.